let's go back to the 1990s. You had the Oslo Accords, and
Yes.
Israel, under sort of U.S. mediation, the Israelis and the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, did this deal whereby the PLO became, the party that ran it, Fatah, became the governing party of a new Palestinian authority in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. So they got a kind of local autonomy, and in return, they recognized Israel, and they helped the Israelis on security. So they became their security partners, tasked with arresting, jihadi terrorists from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And the Palestinian hope was that this would be the embryo of a Palestinian state. But the final status, peace talks never really came about because trust on both sides collapsed. On the Palestinian side, they were unable and perhaps also unwilling to really put an end to terrorism, which increased under the Oslo years. And on the Israeli side, they were unable and unwilling to take on the settler lobby. Instead, the settler population in the West Bank actually doubled during the Oslo years. And the Palestinians saw this and said, hang on, are you talking to us in good faith if you're eating up the land that is supposed to become the Palestinian state? So, trust on both sides collapsed. And then there was this notorious summit in the year 2000 at Camp David, where Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, failed to answer all of the difficult, final status questions. And the Israeli narrative is we offered them everything. They said no and chose terrorism. But I think that in reality, there was a lot of blame to go around on the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, and the American side, who did a terrible job as mediators. Now, fundamentally, there are four different difficult issues when it comes to the two-state solution, i.e. the partition of the land between Israel and the Palestinian state. They are borders, security arrangements, what to do about the refugees and their descendants, and Jerusalem. And on all four positions, the gaps were actually still pretty big in 2000. They tried, the leaders, especially Ehud Barak and Clinton, tried to treat this as the final negotiation. Whereas in actual fact, it was still premature. It turned out to be the beginning of several years of negotiations on these four difficult issues. And they made some breakthroughs. For example, the Palestinians accepted that if they get a state, it won't be on 1967 borders, that they'll have to adjust the borders quite considerably to let the Israelis keep a lot of their settlers and settlements, because Israel just wouldn't be able to remove the entire settler population. So that was one huge concession. And
Israel would compensate with other land elsewhere.
Yes. And then the problem was that the Israelis were offering only kind of like about 1/9 of the land that they wanted to annex, in terms of surface area. And the Palestinians were not impressed with like what land they were offering. So the question of like how much land, which land, what's the land swap deal here? And it was a very bad deal from the Palestinians' point of view. So anyway, these four issues were still pretty open, and the positions were far apart. And Clinton and Barak tried to bounce Arafat into signing anyway. They kind of said, look, this is the best deal you're going to get. Just sign it. And he didn't, because it wasn't a good deal from their point of view, but also he was in a politically, I think, too weak position. Also, many Israelis and Americans wonder whether he was really capable of making the change from being a guerrilla leader, a nationalist revolutionary, into the guy who signs a painful compromise. So perhaps temperamentally, constitutionally, he wasn't capable. But, the thing is, it's not the case that Israel offered everything and offered it,
No. I mean, I didn't say that. And I don't think, to be fair, that even the mainstream Israeli narrative is that they offered everything.
That you hear in Israel. It's like, we offered them everything. They said no and chose terror.
Well, that's silly. That's silly. But because obviously, I mean, everything from the perspective of the average Palestinian would mean everything, all of Israel, no more Jews. No. Like that would mean everything. That would be everything.
It means a state in 1967 borders.
Right, I see.
But of course, when you look at the nitty-gritty, the offer was heavily compromised and actually not that generous.
No, but the narrative that I understand, Marcus, is not that the Israelis gave the Palestinians everything they want, but that the Israelis on numerous occasions tried to, in any negotiation, when I go to a used car dealership, like I make an offer that I know is in my favor, and then I wait for them to come back with an offer that's too much in their favor, and we try to get closer and closer together. The narrative from a lot of the mediators, and you can argue whether or not Bill Clinton is an impartial mediator. Obviously, the US is an ally of Israel's and has its thumb on the scales, but nonetheless, the impression that you get from a lot of these things is that Israel sits down and tries to hammer out what the disagreement is, and they find themselves confronted by a fairly implacable or elusive or mysterious counterpart who walks away and then doesn't do the counteroffer bit. Like it's like the used car salesman just sort of wanders off, and you go, well, what exactly is your counteroffer? Like, what is it?
Yes.
What is it that we would have to give you exactly to make this work? And they never quite get that answer.
Which isn't
the suspicion is that they don't get that answer narrative, because the actual answer is they want all the Palestinians to be able to come back. They want the great-great-grandchildren of the people who were tossed out of Tel Aviv in the 40s to be able to come back.
That is the narrative, and it isn't true. Because if you delve into the negotiations, both in the year 2000 and afterwards, both the negotiators below the level of the leaders were actually talking about these possible solutions, including on the refugee problem. And the positions, began quite far apart, and in the course of several years, they actually got very close. They were almost touching in the year 2008, which is really the time when they were really down to details on a solution for borders, land swaps, the refugee problem, which was really going to be translated into a symbolic return of a limited number, of people who had, close family connections who were still living in Israel. So and compensation for others, for example, a compensation fund. So they were talking about concrete solutions to all of those four difficult issues. The problem is there was never a time when both sides had a leader capable of signing a deal and surviving politically. And even in 2000, Barak, his power was already crumbling. Mm-hmm. There were people defecting from his cabinet. He lost his Knesset majority. He ended up holding half the ministerial posts in the cabinet himself because everyone was defecting. And then he lost elections. And so from the Palestinian point of view, they thought this guy's actually not capable of delivering a deal. We might sign it. If we sign a deal and make painful concessions and cop a lot of heat back home, and then including possibly being killed ourselves. Arafat was afraid of being killed, and then their partner loses elections and it's all for nothing. So there was a fear on both sides that they actually don't have a partner at the top level. And that in the end scuppered the rather forgotten, but I think very important 2008 negotiations between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, when they came much closer than in 2000. And it collapsed because Olmert was indicted for corruption. And back then, that was a bygone era in politics when, politicians who were facing corruption
when being corrupt was a liability. I guess the larger question is if Netanyahu had not won the 2008 election, is there a universe in which there is now a Palestinian state?
There are problems on both sides. Look, I think that politics after the second Intifada was.
Oh yes, sorry, explain that.
Violent uprising in the early 2000s in the West Bank, in particular, and it was eventually suppressed by the Israelis. But it really.
And they say that, just to put color on it, they say the first Intifada was an Intifada of Palestinians throwing rocks and stones, and the second Intifada was an Intifada of them blowing up school buses and shopping centers. Is that fair?
I mean, look, the suicide bombing started in the 90s during the Oslo years, but yes, they absolutely accelerated in the early 2000s. So the level of violence used of terroristic violence by Palestinian militants and also military raids and reprisals by the Israeli military was extremely heavy and violent, and the number of people killed on both sides was much higher than the first Intifada. Yeah. But the effect though was to really, I think, poison the waters on both sides, and yet not fatally. The opinion polls, even from the late 2000s, showed that Israelis and Palestinians, a clear majority, still supported peace based on two states. That only really collapsed after Olmert failed, and Netanyahu won elections, so he became prime minister in early 2009. And has been the dominant person in Israeli politics ever since. And in that 15-year period, public support for the two-state solution collapsed. And that, I think, has a number of factors. I think one is there was no more real peace process, nothing substantial to speak of. Another is that in Israel, Netanyahu really kind of waged a permanent campaign against would-be peacemakers, branding them, peace equals the left equals traitors, equals enemies of the state. In a very famous and effective campaign advert in 2015, that there was an ISIS jeep. So this is a Likud campaign ad on TV. So an ISIS jeep arrived through the sand with sort of ISIS fighters waving ISIS flags and balaclavas. And they draw up to a car containing a liberal, secular Israeli who could be some tech worker from Tel Aviv. And the ISIS guys say, "Brother, which way to Jerusalem?" And the guy says, "Left, keep going left." And then, the ominous voice, in case viewers didn't get it, the ominous voice says, the left means terrorism. Only Likud can stop them. So he really emphatically associated peace and the two-state solution with serving Palestinian interests. And Netanyahu's argument has always been, for decades, not consistently, but often, that a Palestinian state would be a springboard, a launch pad for terror attacks on Israel. And even though Netanyahu's own fortunes have oscillated, his discourse has really become very entrenched. This argument that a Palestinian state would be a security threat, would be a launch pad for terrorism, has become shared deep into the ranks of centrist Israeli politics as well.